Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural American Indian and Indigenous Studies Lecture in Indigenous Knowledge. I'd like to turn it over to Jess Mahar from Smathers Library for reading of land acknowledgement.
Thank you. The Smathers Libraries acknowledge that for thousands of years, the area now comprising the state of Florida has been and continues to be home to many Native nations. We further recognize that the main campus of the University of Florida is located on the ancestral territory of the Patano and the Seminole peoples. The Patano of Timucua affiliation lived here in the Alachua region from before European arrival until the destruction of their towns in the early 1700s. The Seminole, also known as the Alachua Seminole, established towns here shortly after but were forced from the land as a result of a war with the United States known as the Seminole War. The Smathers Libraries acknowledge its obligation to honor the past, present, and future Native residents and cultures of Florida.
Thank you, Janessa. Again, good afternoon, everyone. And this is the inaugural lecture of a new series from American Indian and Indigenous Studies. We are honored to host for this event Dr. Jessie Popp, Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Science at the University of Guelph, Ontario. I am Ken Sassaman, Hyatt and C.C. Brown Professor of Florida Archaeology and Coordinator of American Indian and Indigenous Studies, AIIS, the original AI. AIIS is a consortium of 20 UF faculty members spread across 10 administrative units. It started in 2008 at the urging of undergraduate students of Native American ancestry who rightfully sought greater capacity at UF for the study of Indigenous history and culture. Despite the lack of a recurrent budget and the waxing and waning of membership, the program has provided curriculum options, scholarly programs, and public outreach since its inception 16 years ago. An endowment fund established recently ensures that AIIS will thrive in years to come. In honor of the illustrious career of historian and educator Alfred A. Cave, Mary Kozlowski, Professor Cave's wife, gifted funds to UF in support of Native American studies. The Alfred A. Cave Endowment provides funding for student scholarships, public and academic events, and program development. Today, we launch a new fall lecture series to complement the annual Cave Lecture in Native American history that we sponsor every spring. The theme of this new series is Indigenous Perspectives on Environment in the broadest sense of the term, an antidote to the Western bias of objectifying nature as the imagined right of colonial nations to dispossess and then transform the land of Indigenous people for economic and political gain. Although some aspects of American society have trended towards greater justice and equity since colonial times, heightened threats to environmental protections and Indigenous rights in the U.S. greatly sharpen the relevance of this new series. Before I turn over the podium to my AIIS colleague, Dr. Gretchen Lescord, who will introduce our esteemed guests, please allow me to acknowledge with gratitude the co-sponsors of this event. Imagining Climate Change, thank you, Terry Harpold. Land Use and Environmental Change Institute, thank you, Mark Brenner. George A. Smathers Library, thank you, Janessa. And 2 units of UF's Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, the School of Forestry, Fisheries, and Geomatic Sciences, and Wildlife Ecology and Conservation. And thank you, Gretchen, for making those arrangements. And I'll now turn the podium over to you. Thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you, Ken. Hi, everyone. My name is Gretchen Lescord. I'm an assistant professor in forest, fisheries, and geomatic sciences on the forestry side, and I have the privilege of introducing our guest speaker today. I'm happy to introduce the inaugural speaker of our new environmental seminar series, Dr. Jessie Popp. As Ken said, Dr. Popp is an associate professor at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. She is also a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Science and a member of Weequamequong Unceded Territory. As the PI of the Wildlife, Indigenous Science, and Ecology Lab, also known as the WISE Lab, Dr. Popp and her research team work to weave Indigenous and Western knowledge systems to contribute to the advancement of environmental and ecological science. They embrace holistic and transdisciplinary research approaches to investigate ecological questions identified by the Indigenous communities and organizations that they partner with. In addition to her 12 active community partnerships, Dr. Popp has published numerous very impactful peer-reviewed papers that detail the process behind building these collaborations, which provide invaluable guidance to others interested in community science done in a good way. She has quickly emerged as a leading expert and a trailblazer in Indigenous science and has given many seminars across North America and participated in international panels. It's truly a privilege to welcome her to the University of Florida and to learn from her today.
Thank you, Gretchen and Ken, and thank you everyone for being here and for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here, an honor to be here, and thank you especially to the funders who help support this awesome time I've had so far here. So I just want to start off. Can everyone hear me okay? Is this working good? Okay. So I want to start off by saying Ani, Ezongadee, Katapwa Kwe, Indigenous Cause, Wikwim Kong Donjaba, and Anishinaabe Kwe, and Dao, Miigwech. So I just introduced myself in Anishinaabemowin, which is the language of the Anishinaabe people. And we do this in Canada often as a way to help raise awareness about language diversity, and also thinking about language preservation. So I introduced myself and said, hello, my name is Black Bear Strong Heart Woman. I am Bear Clan and a member of Wikwim-Kong unceded territory. Yeah, so it's a real pleasure joining you today. And today I would like to share a little bit with you about my journey through academia and how I came to be in this Indigenous environmental science realm, which maybe a lot of you haven't heard too much about or are just starting to learn about. And I want to share this with you through talking about weaving ways of knowing among the trees. So to start us off, I had the pleasure of yesterday touring around some of Gainesville and seeing some of the beautiful lush environments, and it was just so awesome. So I want to start off the talk imagining that we are walking through a forest, maybe a trail on a forest on a warm day, much like we have here. It's winter up where I'm from, but beautiful, beautiful weather. And walking through a mixed wood forest, which was what I got to experience yesterday for the most part. Lush and vibrant. And while you're walking, seeing all the different tree species, I know that I saw palms yesterday, I saw pine trees, I saw a whole bunch of understory, squirrels, seeing birds flying overhead, insects fluttering by. Maybe hearing, we heard songs, like a symphony of different birds singing together. And it was just stunning. It was beautiful. And as I was walking, and as you maybe walk, through a forest, a beautiful forest, you really come to realize that each of these beings, each of these plants, animals, all play a very particular role in such a beautiful environment, each with unique contributions, all valuable and all belonging. So now as you're soaking this in, how an environment like this makes you feel, and even here on campus, just walking out the doors even, it's very lush, very, very amazing. So an environment like this could make you feel maybe calm, soothed, happy, well. Maybe after writing a test or taking a class that's a bit stressful, you can walk outside and just feel a little bit better by being on the land. At least I do. So something else I got to see yesterday was a plantation. So I want you to imagine that we're continuing this walk on a trail through a forest, and the forest kind of changes into a pine tree plantation. So trees planted by humans for the purpose of one day being able to harvest their wood, tall, towering trees with maybe a ground covered in moss, or we saw, I don't know if that was like a palm sort of shrubby species, but that was one of the few species, understory species that we saw. So it's easy to see this unique understory species because these large trees were planted around the same time. They're about equal height and really shading out the forest floor below. Now, in a forest like this, you're likely to hear less sounds. You don't hear that symphony of birds that you might have seen in the other forest. It's almost eerie. This man-made forest does not support the life that the mixed wood forest did. So maybe as you're walking, you start to realize it was the diversity of the mixed wood forest that helped to allow life to thrive. So walking through a pine tree plantation, in a sense, is the way I felt when I was embarking on a journey through university. So I was a biology student, a student of the natural sciences, an Anishinaabe student with mixed European heritage, but I was proud of my ancestry, and I still am today. I guess growing up, you could say I sort of had a foot in two worlds, sometimes seeing things through an Indigenous or Anishinaabeg lens, and sometimes seeing things through a more Eurocentric or Western lens. But two worlds was not what I was exposed to in school. Historically, following colonization of these lands, also known as North America, Eurocentric education systems were founded. Most of us know today that when Europeans arrived in this land, also known as North America, Indigenous peoples and our ways of knowing were considered inferior. Settlers thought we needed to be civilized through assimilation. In fact, John A. Macdonald, who was Canada's first prime minister, said that the great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system, assimilate the Indian or Indigenous people in all respects with the other inhabitants of the Dominion as speedily as they are fit to change. So now many of us know the horrors, tragedies, and injustices that resulted from this way of thinking. You've probably heard about residential schools and much more. But today, much of society has begun to recognize the importance of moving forward together in support of reconciliation, and we are collectively understanding that all ways of coming to know the world are equally valuable and important. And so change is happening. So people are moving forward with weaving ways of knowing in the work they do, including in the natural sciences. And multiple ways of knowing there are. So you see, worldviews and ways of knowing can differ among cultures, nations, communities, families, and even individuals. With regards to Indigenous peoples, there are hundreds of distinct nations across this land and across Canada, for example, as well. Each with unique cultures, languages, and ways of understanding the world, yet equally important to one another. But among Indigenous philosophies, there tend to be similarities in some aspects. So for example, having values that prioritize good relationships with the land. So you may have heard of this term, Indigenous knowledge systems, traditional ecological knowledge, Aboriginal knowledge. There's been lots of terms used to describe essentially what we more commonly now refer to as Indigenous knowledge systems. Indigenous knowledge systems because they are diverse along with the diversity of Indigenous peoples. And Indigenous knowledge systems are derived from Indigenous ways of knowing, often seen as important in contributing ecological knowledge. But Indigenous knowledge systems do that, but also so much more. So Dr. Deb McGregor, who's a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice, an Indigenous scholar, has recently shared that Indigenous knowledge is not just knowledge, a noun, but it's a way of life, something that must be lived, a verb, in order to be understood. Indigenous knowledge is inseparable from the people who hold and live this knowledge. Indigenous knowledge systems are ways of life, not something that you can just take and use for something else. Indigenous knowledge systems hold original instructions. For example, instructions for how to relate to all of creation. Many Indigenous knowledge systems, for example, recognize the earth as our mother who cares for us and provides us with all that we need, that we are related to and interconnected with all life, and that all our relations, humans or non-human, are our kin. and that we must always prioritize respect, responsibility, and reciprocity in all that we do. So bringing together or weaving multiple knowledge systems may provide holistic perspectives, allowing people to see what they may have missed with a single lens alone. There are many frameworks that have been used, that have been described, developed by various Indigenous peoples and nations to embrace multiple perspectives and knowledge systems. One of those that you may have heard of, for example, is Adwabtamunk, which is Mi'kmaq for two-eyed seeing. This is a concept coined by Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall from Unama'ki, or Cape Breton in Canada. And he describes how we can better understand the world, the ecosystem, ecology, the environment, or in general. We can better understand systems for the benefit of all through seeing through multiple lenses. And here he uses the example, two lenses or two eyes. An example, one with the strengths of Indigenous ways of knowing or knowledge systems, one through the strengths of Western ways of knowing or knowledge systems. And the idea is that seeing through these multiple lenses, you'll see things maybe that one just didn't see and have a more holistic or full picture of something that's happening. So I think you may know that there are many examples of weaving ways of knowing in the sciences that improve science as a whole. When you're seeing the bigger picture, you're improving science. So I want to emphasize that myself, I began to learn this through my own research. I went to a very Eurocentric institutions, to the universities I went to, and I didn't get to learn about Indigenous knowledge systems or two-eyed seeing in the university. So talking a little bit about my journey, just to really emphasize that I started out as a Western trained scientist. And I was much like most of you or all of you, very busy with my head in the books. I was always studying, I was really focusing on, those good academic grades. And it wasn't until I went to my first conference as an undergrad student, and I was so excited about this. My advisor had taken me and he brought me to this beautiful building, much like this. This is a great room. And there's these beautiful wood doors, and he opened them and he stretched out his arms and he said, "Welcome to the Old Boys Club." And it was at that moment that I was like, "Old Boys Club." I looked around the room. I was like, "Whoa, this is the Old Boys Club." And I really started thinking at that point, first of all, like, where are the women? Even in my university, was trying to struggle to think, who are the female professors in my university that are even teaching me, let alone researchers. And then I started thinking, where are Indigenous people, like having, Indigenous ancestry, and thinking, why don't I hear or see Indigenous people in the natural sciences? So I really started thinking about this Old Boys Club and realized that I needed to be part of the change I wanted to see in the world. So continuing on with my own learning and investigating, how could we make change? I continued on through grad school, again, very Western science type degree. And I actually was focusing on elk research. So elk are this beautiful ungulate that you see here. And my PhD was actually investigating reintroduction success purely through a Western scientific lens. So a little bit about that, but not very much. Historically, there were 10 million elk estimated to be across the lands known as North America. So this is a distribution map with the lighter gray showing the historical distribution of elk and the dark gray showing the current, or at least since 2014, distribution of elk. So historically, 10 million elk were estimated. After, as colonization was happening, overhunting, habitat loss, by the late 1800s, elk were completely extirpated from Eastern North America. By 1970, there were estimated to be about 500,000 elk left, a 95% reduction. And this is common among many of these large mammal species that we have in North America. So you can see along the Rocky Mountains here, you see this really concentration of dark gray where elk kind of really concentrated. And the thought there is that, that's a more inhospitable environment. hard to, make farmland or go hunting. So elk kind of found refuge there. So then you also see in the east a couple of very small pockets of elk. Those are actually elk reintroductions. So folks would take elk from the west and reintroduce them to the east in the hope to establish populations again, reestablish populations. And my job for my PhD really was to investigate all these elk populations that were reintroduced over the past century, some of them doing really well and some of them doing very poorly. And I was trying to figure out why. So I won't talk too much about the why, but one thing that I found while I was doing some of this work was that railways and train collisions actually really impacted elk population. So we have an elk population near Laurentian University with a railway that directly bisects the elk range. And this is something that you would frequently see, multiple elk getting hit by trains and dying, and not something that was previously documented. 39% of our known mortality from collared elk was shown to be from railways, the top cause of mortality, followed by predation. So elk are gregarious in nature. They travel in groups together. And when walking down a railway, if a train's coming, their anti-predator strategy is to run. And where are you going to run? In the deep snow that's going to like impede you from moving, or straight down the path of least resistance? So often there would be many elk that would unfortunately die. And so it was very concerning. So of course I was sharing this information, doing some literature review, finding that there's virtually nothing in terms of railway ecology that exists. And so I started sharing this work. And at one time I was at a conference and some of my First Nation colleagues said, yeah, you're finding elk, you're finding large mammals getting hit by trains. You should see what happens to our turtles. And I was like, wow, turtles, like that's kind of important because every turtle species in Ontario, we have quite a few, are actually a species at risk. And the communities that we were talking to wanted to hear more. They heard their community members saying this. They said, well, we need to listen. We need to learn a little bit more about this. So together with Magnetawan First Nation and Shawanaga First Nation, two Indigenous communities in Ontario, we decided to talk to community members a little bit more to get their take on what's actually happening. We actually did official interviews. We spoke to elders, knowledge holders within both communities that actually had a railway bisecting their First Nation reserves. We asked questions about railway impacts on wildlife in general and more. So one community member from Magnetawan said, when you go down the highway where the railway is, you see skeletons of animals, especially their heads, you know that they must have got hit by a train. So people were seeing this. Lots of people were seeing these mortalities expanding far beyond large mammals. Jerry Smith said, we find lots of turtles on the railway tracks. On hot days, those turtles step over the tracks. They don't make it across the track sometimes because they start boiling right on the track. They die within the track. So this is not something that was previously documented by Western science, and the communities were very concerned. Turtles are very, like all species, are very important culturally to the First Nations. So together, based on the conversations we had with communities, we asked further questions about, well, what should we be looking for? Where should we be looking for it? And when should we be looking for it and why? And so then we partnered with Dr. Jackie Litzkes, who's a herpetologist, because I am not. So she studies reptiles and amphibians. And so I was doing the mammal side. We co-developed a project together based on the knowledge that was shared with us by community members to further explore railway ecology and the impacts on wildlife. Kyle Vincent was one of these students in the Wildlife Indigenous Science Ecology Lab, in my lab. And so he was part of this collaboration that was born based upon the concerns shared by the communities. So again, they showed us where to look, what to look for, when to look, and why. And then we started doing these weekly surveys over 3 years. And these are the two communities in Ontario and where they're located. So Kyle was doing weekly surveys, walking the rail and looking for signs of animals. We also put up cameras along the railway just to see, we're going to see things, on cameras different than if a person's walking by because they can sense us coming. We actually found just about every medium to large mammal species that inhabits the area using the railway. And not just once, but over and over and over, like a travel corridor. So we've got a moose there, we've got a fisher, we've got a red fox, a wolf or coyote mix, and carrying some sort of probably scavenged food item there. This is something else we don't know. Are railways important sources of food for scavengers? Does that increase risk to scavengers? Will they get hit by trains? So there's just so much that we don't know. So these are just 4 species that I'm showing you, but we found every species, every medium to large mammal species that we have was using the railway. So based on our discussions, further discussions with community members, we were asking folks about, what sort of animals are you seeing on the railway? And Kyle talked to folks, about 17 individuals in Shawanaga and 15 in Magnetawan, and sort of just summarized this just generally in the relative proportions of mentions and interviews on what folks were seeing on the railways. So people did see large mammals, much like I suspected, but also medium mammals, small mammals, turtles, snakes, amphibians, birds. And through Kyle's surveys, he found, yes, okay, so with these camera traps, we did see these mammals. We also saw on our camera traps birds, amphibians, reptiles, but turtles. Much like people said, through these on-foot surveys, we found so many turtles. Turtles were getting over the tracks, probably enticed there, we think, because they're warm and reptiles like nice warm places, maybe even nesting material. And they would actually get stuck between the railway ties. They become entrapped between those ties and they couldn't get out. So some of them were getting hit by trains, but others were just dying because of desiccation. You can see the little snapper there on the lower left that just seemed to desiccate. And the one on the lower right, that turtle seemed to get stuck in the creosote that would leach from the rails. We kind of call it this turtle tar. Again, not something that Western science had documented, but things that community members had shared with us as things that were happening. The ties, we were measuring the temperatures. So in one summer, for example, the ties were 50 degrees Celsius, which is very warm. On average, they were 30% warmer than air temperature. So very, very warm environments. There were multitude of dead and alive observations. So here I was initially thinking that large mammals were the most affected because this is what I was studying, very narrow-minded. But when we found, by taking the lead from the communities that we partnered with who shared their knowledge with us, that yes, mammals were being found dead and alive, but so were snakes, turtles, and look at the amphibians. Like there's a lot more to this that we don't know. So we found things we never expected. And this is really important because we have information now that can help us further research and make, hopefully in the future, informed decisions in developing mitigation strategies for species at risk. So that's kind of how I started in the realm of, listening to folks, sharing knowledge, and co-developing a project together where we just, found things we didn't think we'd find before. So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit in my journey, which isn't that long, but switch gears here to another interesting relation that we are working to better understand in the WISE lab, and that is moose. So moose are an ungulate that is decreasing across most of its range in the lands known as North America. There's lots of Western science trying to understand why moose are decreasing. And there's a lot of, complicated likely reasons, but we don't know all the answers. We definitely don't. And we're still trying to understand that. Now, this decline in moose is very concerning to all people because moose are a very important harvest animal, generating lots of funds provincially, but also very important to Indigenous communities. Moose are also relied on for food, but so much more, which we'll talk about in a minute. So Bigtagong Nishnawbeg, partnering with the AOFRC, which is where I was at the time, and later Shawanaga and Magnetawan First Nation, we're very interested in exploring the drivers of moose population decline, but also really wanted to share knowledge and perspectives on the importance of moose and moose harvest to the community, and partly because there is a lot of conflict among the provincial government and Indigenous communities, people not seeing eye to eye because there's different ways of knowing and understanding the world, different cultures, so not, needing to understand a little bit better each other. So wanting to share the importance of moose in general. changes in the moose population observed over the last 15 to 20 years related to the M&R surveys, the provincial government surveys, factors associated or drivers associated with moose declines, impacts of those declines to community, and support for the development of a community-based monitoring program. So with these communities, we jointly determined our methodological approach and decided to engage in a series of discussions with community members. We interviewed a total of 66 people from all 3 communities, and were engaged with these communities the entire time, learning, listening, sharing, having information sessions, and we learned so much. The majority of people we spoke to had observed moose population declines, but also shared factors they observed to be drivers of moose decline from all 3 communities. So these are just the 3 different communities, the different colors. The top thing that people said were affecting moose was climate change, but also disease and parasites, harvest pressure, roads, habitat disturbance, predation, other wildlife, developmental contaminants, and railways. So a lot of different things going on there that people are observing, which was very similar to what Western science was saying. Lots of different factors related to moose decline. So then we worked together to weave the knowledge that was shared with us with the Western scientific literature. So this is just a figure showing the outcomes of that work, showing the proportions or number of mentions from the interviews and from the Western science literature about these different, so Anishinaabe knowledge and Western science, and these factors related to that people were saying were drivers. So the study revealed that there was agreement among knowledge systems on the importance of climate change, disease, parasites, and explaining moose population decline. But that said, we found that Western science studies tended to focus a bit more on the effects of habitat disturbance and predation on moose, while communities emphasized harvest pressures as being more important. Other factors identified by both knowledge systems included the impacts of roads and railways, whereas Indigenous participants also mentioned moose displacement from white-tailed deer expansion, the negative effects of contaminants introduced by development, including mining and forestry. So things a little bit different. So this is where that 2-eyed seeing comes in. You know, one way of seeing and another may have complementary perspectives, may see things a little bit differently, or that one way of seeing the world may have missed. So overall, essentially, we found complementarities and a more holistic approach and perspectives through this work, with insights where we can collaboratively further our understanding related to drivers of moose population decline. So while we learned a lot about the drivers related to moose population decline, we learned so much more, things that we just really didn't expect that would be part of this work. And one of the most eye-opening, wonderful events that I've ever attended was the Moose Hunt Camp as part of this work. So the Moose Hunt Camp is essentially where the Anishinaabe community, in this case, Big Tugong Anishinaabe, would completely shut down for the week. Instead of going to work in the community, folks would go to Moose Hunt Camp. A lot of people were camping there. Some people would just come out for the day. Schools, nobody was going to school. They were jumping on the bus or camping there, and they were heading every day to Moose Hunt Camp and back. And that is because it was a learning opportunity. It was a way to keep culture and tradition and teachings alive. People were coming together. They were learning about harvesting moose. There was people out hunting moose for those who couldn't harvest moose, for the elders who were just too old to hunt, for those with disabilities. People were hunting for their community to share, in sort of a sharing economy. So learning how to harvest moose, learning how to use every part of the moose, how to be respectful in harvesting practices, but so much more. So I was actually tenting beside a traditional healer, and you could see his tent up top there, and he was hanging medicines everywhere and teaching the community as they'd walk by, or taking us on medicine walks, making tea, keeping that medicinal knowledge alive. We learned how to process wild rice, how to make birch bark baskets, how to weave fishing nets, how to traditionally cook goose on a fire. We made moose calls out of birch bark. And again, learning how to respect moose. The youth were constantly involved in moose, and even the youth. There was bonfires happening all over, and they would take a piece of moose meat and just throw it on a rock in the fire and douse it with salt. They were trying to cook moose, and it was just awesome seeing the entire community come together for learning and for building social relationships, for having a good time. It was quickly apparent just how important moose were for food, but also for culture, traditions, social relationships, and so much more. We spoke about this, but we also lived it for several days. And I realized through this work that the socio-ecological aspects of the work that we do in the natural sciences is so important because everything is connected. So through these interviews we did, people shared some examples of how important moose were. Sharon Desmond said, for example, moose are part of our main heritage of who we are as the Anishinaabe. It's who we are. It's not just a piece of something we like to do. It is who we are. Juanita Starr said a lot of people don't realize, most people see moose as food, but it's not just food. It's more than food. It's creating a circle of being. You're getting teaching aspects. You're getting social aspects. You're getting the value of moose far greater than any one person thinks. Moose are important for ecological integrity, but also for cultural integrity. And I think we really need to rethink how we engage with and caretake wildlife to ensure that we consider all relationships as well, because humans are part of nature. We are not separate from it. So this is an example. This is our illustration that an Indigenous artist created for us based on what folks were sharing with us that were the importance of moose. So yes, important for food, but also for fostering social relationships, facilitating opportunities for knowledge sharing, for teaching youth. Moose are important for material use. Every part of the moose is used for keeping traditions alive, for supporting identity, and of course, for the environment. So based on this work and the misconceptions and misunderstandings that maybe cultures can have among one another, we really realize that we need to work together more to help support better relationships among each other, to help provide learning opportunities for one another. We need to work together, though, in ethical ways, in ethical spaces, if you've heard of that term. So the next steps of this work are to develop a moose knowledge network where we can bring Indigenous people together with government and academics to respectfully engage in these discussions collaboratively. So Kate Yarchuk is another master's student in the WISE Lab, working with myself and Magnetawan First Nation and many other nations as well, and with the Ontario provincial government. And she engaged in conversations with folks from the government, folks from the academic realm that worked on moose, and then from First Nations. And she just basically asked people, if we were to bring everyone together in a room to talk about moose, what are some important values you think we should have before we even step in that room? Because those conversations often go very poorly. So talking to all people, she represented what they shared with her in this graphic. So this is called a word cloud. So the words that are bigger are just representing the words that were shared the most from people that we spoke to. So people shared things like respect is important, listening, having humility, embracing reciprocity, trust, being open, compassionate, having clear expectations, collaborating. So these are some pretty common sense things that often aren't taken into consideration when you have a room full of people trying to solve a problem that really should be at the forefront. And this is our hope, is that we will take these values that everyone brought up and bring them to the forefront of future discussions. So more on that in the future. We're continuing this work and we're pretty excited about it. And the last project I want to share with you briefly is a Mayengan, which is Anishinaabe for Wolf Project. This is a collaboration based on concerns of multiple nations, Wikwemkong, Magnetawan, and Shawanaga, who were very interested in understanding wolves in their traditional territories. So in Ontario, we have sort of this canid soup, they'll call it. We have a species at risk, eastern wolf. We have your gray wolf. We have coyotes. And these eastern wolves are actually a species at risk. And why they're a species at risk is because they hybridize with all the other wolves. So genetically, that's bad news for them. But we don't know a lot about eastern wolves, how their behaviors, spatial ecologies might differ from your typical gray wolf or coyotes. You can't even tell you can't physically distinguish among hybrids because they're so hybridized. So you have to genetically identify them. So the nations that were leading this work wanted to even first document if there were eastern wolves in their traditional territory, and then if there are, exploring their spatial ecology. So getting together with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, a collaboration was born, an excellent partnership, and we established the Mayingan Wotsamajig Leadership Group, which means those that walk with wolves. So we had a leadership circle. We have a leadership circle with representatives from the First Nation communities we work with, who each bring knowledge from their communities, and we discuss throughout the entire project. We develop it together, we come up with the methodologies together, we talk about what's important, we share results to communities together. And together it was decided that the best way to answer the questions that communities were interested in spatial ecology was through GPS collars. Wolves have enormous territories, and it is very difficult to study them without actually having collars on them. So we also wanted to make sure that we included ceremony, our community members, utmost respect for Mayingan as kin. So we had all these values as part of this project, and beginning with the GPS collaring, we have to do this through a combination of ground trapping and helicopter work. And it can be very costly and time consuming. Helicopter work, if you don't know, is very, very expensive. And you have to first find the wolves before you can collar them. They're very difficult to find. So this can take a lot of time and money. But the elders that were part of the Mayingan Wotsamajig leadership circle said, well, why don't we just talk to those who know wolves best? Why don't we talk to our community members? So that's exactly what we did. We spoke to those who knew wolves best, who were on the land, who were familiar with the annual cycles of Mayingan, who were familiar with where wolves would be at what time of year. And this is Elder Theodore Flamand and Jerry Burke from Wikwimacong, and we're gifting him with a beautiful piece of art there because he was so helpful in telling us, you know, if you're looking for the wolves next week, this is probably where they'll be. And so we took the helicopter out there, and there's Theodore up in the helicopter bringing the knowledge that was shared with him from Jerry and all the other community members. And then there's Stephen Kell, part of another community, bringing that knowledge from the other, from Shawanaga First Nation. And if you can see through the window, there's a little wolf on the ice. So we found the wolves exactly where the community member said we would find them. We saved a ton of time, a ton of money, and this helped tremendously with our search efforts. So here's just an example, a wolf on the ice, and there's the helicopter capture crew that was, so basically we would net gun the wolves very quick to reduce as much stress as possible, take a genetic sample, put the collar on, and let them run. So very, very successful in this step of the project. And this is an example of some of the data that we're getting from these GPS collars. They would send us a location point every 4 hours. And this is just in one region. We had a lot of wolves collared through this work. You can see every color here is a different wolf, so that we were able to define pack territories, GPS, genetic composition. So we determined that there are eastern wolves in each territory. And then you could start to see movements and seasonal movements. What's important? Travel corridors. Are there travel corridors that we need to protect? So there are so many questions that we can answer now with this, but throughout the entire process, we have been respectful and inclusive of the values that were shared with us. So for example, we smudged the helicopter. You know, we used traditional teachings in the ground trapping that we did. And we are bringing these teachings of Mayingan or wolves as kin to the youth in the communities and engaging them in this work as well. What kid doesn't want to do wolf work? Like, it's so cool. So still a work in progress, but the Canadian Museum of Nature, which is it's a pretty big museum in Canada, in Ottawa, heard about what we were doing and wanted to feature this project for a year that just wrapped up in the museum as an example of bringing together knowledge systems for caretaking of our relations. It was really cool because they invited us, the researchers and youth from our partner communities, to go see pictures of themselves in this exhibit. And actually a lot of the youth were going to the big city for the first time and we're just blown away. So it was a really awesome project, and really it's still ongoing, but amazing to see the support for this type of work. So these are just some examples of what we've done in the lab of how we've worked to braid knowledge systems, but there are many other incredible people across the world doing this type of work. And while it is important to do this work, probably the most important thing that I have come to learn is that how we proceed is just as important as that we do. Research has been very harmful and extractive to Indigenous peoples, so much so that the word research or science has become a bad word to many nations and communities. Mistrust has formed, a hesitancy to think about engaging in research because of the harms that have been done in the past. So this is probably the most important thing that I've learned throughout my time as a researcher. So thinking about, we have to move forward in doing this work. How we proceed is just as important. We have to do things in a good way. You may have heard that word. It's getting pretty common among the literature, proceeding in good ways. And what does that mean? So I want to, like, when talking about weaving knowledge systems, weaving being respecting the integrity of both knowledge systems, not blending or integrating, but maintaining the integrity. Imagine a braid, and this is a braid of sweetgrass, an important medicine to the Anishinaabe. If you've read the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, she uses a braid of sweetgrass as a metaphor for something different. Highly recommend that book if anyone wants to learn more about this beautiful, beautiful book. But yeah, so imagine you're taking a braid. You're braiding, say you're braiding Indigenous knowledge, Western knowledge, you're braiding it together with two strands. What happens when you braid with two strands and let go? It's just going to unravel. You need that third strand when you're making a braid. So braiding together, doing things in a good way to make that strong, to create strength so that we can proceed in better, more successful ways. A little bit more on what a good way means. So myself with other Indigenous authors recently published a paper in Nature that kind of talks about that a little bit more. Ecological research in a good way, essentially meaning ethical and equitable relationships with Indigenous peoples and the lands. So this is just based on our collective experiences as Indigenous people and working with Indigenous community organizations and people and really listening to what they think in a good way means. How can we repair the past damages? How can we work together better? Because there are a heck ton of environmental issues, major environmental issues facing us all today. I'm sure you all learned about a lot of them. And we need to solve these problems together. And we need to work together in respectful ways, in good ways to make that happen. So while there are Indigenous frameworks like two-eyed seeing that emphasize ways to bring together knowledge systems, there are also Indigenous frameworks that describe important values or principles to include when engaging in research with Indigenous peoples. And here are a few examples. So this one is the 5 R's of Indigenous research, which we use as sort of a framework for the work in the WISE Lab. So the 5 R's of Indigenous research being responsibility, respect, relevance, reciprocity, with relationships being the very core of everything. So co-creating a research process grounded in these 5 R's, with relevance being the relevance of research questions and outcomes to Indigenous priorities, experiences, and needs. Being respectful of Indigenous people's knowledge systems and cultural integrity. We all have important ways of seeing the world. Considering reciprocity, a give and take between people or between people and the land. So giving back, and not just by answering an ecological question, but how else can you give back to the land in the work that you do in general, with Indigenous peoples or not? How else can you give back to each other, to the land? Being responsible, having that responsibility to work together and care for the land for future generations. What we do today is impacting the future, and we are responsible for those impacts. Our relationships being the core between people, living beings, and systems of the spiritual and natural world. So the values or priorities for working together, particularly in an environmental research context can be broadly encompassing, like the 5 R's. And also can be, there is no checklist for doing things in a good way. What a good way means can differ, like, among communities, right? A different community can have different expectations or suggestions for how to work in a good way. So we wanted to engage in discussions with Indigenous peoples across the lands known as Canada to ask more about, in general, what are some important considerations and values that we need to bring in to the process of environmental research when working together in good ways. So Dr. Ali Menzies, who was a postdoc in the WISE lab, now at the University of Calgary, talked to people across Canada, Indigenous people, and sort of represented what folks shared with her in a dream catcher. So having creation and natural law at the very core of everything, and relationships being the thread that binds everything together, with important values that we should work on together being reciprocity, gratitude, humility, agency, responsibility, and so on. And these feathers here representing other important priorities like listening to community priorities, seeking guidance from elders, prioritizing youth involvement, fostering connections with the lands, and more. So these are important to consider broadly, but it's also important to be aware, again, that Indigenous people, although we do have broad philosophies and values that unite us, our values and priorities can also be very nation or community specific because we are not all the same. So Claire Kemp, a master's student in the WISE lab, this is, apologize, very hard to see. This was her poster, but if you just look at the big text, it'll give the example, the core message here. Her work was on optimizing community-based wildlife monitoring through prioritizing Indigenous knowledge and values. So essentially the community wanted to have a biodiversity monitoring program in their community. We used camera traps to be able to monitor medium to large mammal species. But before we did that, she was asking the community specifically and the members of the community, how do we make sure we're doing environmental research in a good way with your community? And people mentioned, well, you have to be respectful. You have to embrace reciprocity, interconnection, relationships, collaboration. So this is her poster showing how for each of these values that were identified, how she brought that into the work. So like, yes, it's a natural science study. It is, biodiversity monitoring, but it is so much more. We're trying to be interdisciplinary and understanding the interconnection and the importance of the socio-ecological aspects of the work that we do. Hopefully try to be successful in developing projects in a good way. So change is happening, and it's happening now in a big way, but we still need to do better. Anishinaabe journalist and chairperson for Canada Council of the Arts, Jesse Wente, is an incredible speaker. Everything he says is a quote. And I once got the opportunity to sit in and watch him, and I was writing everything down. And here's one of them that I grabbed from him. And he shared that in thinking about inclusion and diversity, think of a forest, much like the forest we talked about at the beginning. Is there one kind of tree? No. That tells us the natural way is diverse. And being inclusive in the work that we do in the natural sciences and beyond, we can see things like we never saw before. We can understand things more holistically, and if we respect one another and work together in good ways, we can better address some of the major issues facing us all today. And while it might seem like there's a lot to do and a really long way to go, we really can get there together if we choose to prioritize proceeding in good ways. So 2 quotes shared from elders through workshops that the WISE Lab is engaged in. One being all of us, not just elders, not just you, everybody. We all need to be working together. And that's one of the advantages of traditional knowledge, is that there is hope. So never lose hope. So just like a diverse forest flourishes, so too do our work and our lives when we embrace diversity in the natural sciences and beyond. Society has started to really see this now. As people listen and learn, we're essentially being gifted with seeds of knowledge. And more we are planting those seeds when we share perspectives. So in thinking about environments that aren't so diverse, for example, a pine tree plantation, we are planting seeds in those types of forests. We are changing monocultures into diverse environments. And these types of environments are ones in which we all belong. So with this, I would like to leave you with a gift of seeds and invite you to learn more and to help our environment flourish, because it is only together that we can plant enough seeds to transform the forest. So miigwech, thank you very much for listening.